we need to get data from Salesforce somehow. So what tools do we use inside of Apex to get that data? And we'll start with that question, then I may dive deeper into it a little bit more.
So, so we're talking about getting data from Salesforce, right?
Correct.
All
Into your
right,
Apex code.
to Express code. So, one of the ways of doing that is using SOQL queries. The other
Mm-hmm.
ways of doing that as well is the SOSL, so SOSL, and so like those are like just two different types of way to retrieve data into our Apex so we can manipulate it. SOSL is more of like textual type base, and it goes cross multiple objects, where SOQL is more of like very specific and goes to a particular object, and can get very granular with other conditions.
Yeah, they're tongue twisters, right?
Oh yeah.
So do you use SOQL versus SOSL more than the others in your previous roles, or in your day-to-day Apex development?
Yeah, I would say I definitely use SOQL more than SQL for sure.
Mm-hmm. Speaking on that a little bit more, I want to ask you on some of the best practices, maybe for Salesforce development in general, but if you know any for SOQL or SOQL, can you kind of talk to me about that?
Oh yeah. So some of the things in regards to SOQL is that we never really want to put SOQL queries into for loops on Apex. So this kind of goes into that whole government limit of 101 SOQL queries within a single transaction. So we try to avoid that SOQL, that government limit when we're hitting that. There's also some other things as well, some best practices such as not using is not null, and we're
Mm-hmm.
getting more granular with like the conditioning when the where statements, and we want to use like very specifically like granular conditions rather than not null in our conditions.
Yeah, really cool. So you mentioned the SOQL query governor limit of 101 being hit. So generally, when you put a SOQL query in a loop and you're iterating over that over and over again, once it hits the SOQL limit, or it does it 100 times or 101 times, then a governor limit will pop, right? So once that's in a loop. So what design strategies can we do when we're writing our code to get around that sort of error that that limit that exists? I don't know if I'll call it an error, but the limit that is imposed upon us. So what can we do if we see a for loop with a SOQL statement inside of it? How do we write that code to be better?
Most definitely. So one of the ways for sure, one of the ways is to use a data structure such as this, or you can use maps in order to put our data in this from the query into a data structure so that we can loop over that data structure rather than query that the query inside the for loop. So we use lists or a map or a data structure that can hold that data so that we can manipulate it and read through that data in a for loop.
Yeah, that sounds great. Really just, like you mentioned, bringing the data up, and then after you've done that big selection at the top, you can loop through all of your information afterwards. So that's really great. The other kind of best practice I want to hit on as well is maybe on triggers. So I'm going to start out very broad. What are some like trigger best practices that you know of?
Most definitely. So one of the things that we try to avoid with triggers is adding like that logic to the trigger. So if we're doing like any SOQL queries or something like that, we kind of want to avoid that. And we just want to look at the context in which we want to call a particular handler class that will handle that logic and take that logic outside the trigger. So we handle all of the context in regards to the before, after, before delete, and before update, and after update, and so on in the actual trigger. And then we'll call a handler class that will handle the logic for those particular contexts and manipulate that data in the handler class which is just another Apex class that will essentially manipulate that data based off of the trigger context.
Yeah, very cool. And definitely a pattern that I have used before in a lot of my development. So that was kind of, a big chunk of trigger best practices in there as well. Is there any, I guess, other trigger best practices that you would also hit on, maybe, related to the amount of triggers that you have or how you structure your triggers?
Oh yeah, most definitely. So one of the things that we try to make sure that we have is only one trigger per object.
Mm-hmm.
That's definitely number one for sure, because you never really want to have multiple triggers, and we can get into this whole rounds of conflicting triggers firing between each other, and in this continuous like recursion.
Yeah, for
Um,
sure.
so yeah, that's definitely number one. I can't think of any other ones on top of my head right now.
Yeah, I think you hit on a bunch of really good points there. The only other one that I may call out, and as you're learning, as you're going through stuff, you can pick up on it, but is to make sure to bulkify some of your trigger data that you're getting through. So you never really want to run your trigger with the idea of one single record is being processed, but to group the records together so that you can process over them in batches in a batch fashion.